Well, hello there, students. We got Mr. Skaggs here coming at you with a online lecture video over Renaissance arts. So we're going to be checking out Standard 743 today. That's what you guys need. It's on the screen right here. You need your composition book. You need a pencil, highlighter, and your Renaissance art note sheet. Looks like this. You've got some spaces to fill in. So today, we're going to be using this to look at Standard 743, which is to explain the development of Renaissance art, including the significance of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, William Shakespeare, and systems of patronage. So this is about our third lesson looking at the Renaissance. And as we've talked about previously in our last couple lessons, the Renaissance is a rebirth, a resurgence of art, literature, and learning during the 15th, 16th century in Europe. They had rediscovered classics from ancient Greek and Rome, and there was this development of new thought, new art, and style that came from that. And so today we're going to be looking at specifically what was the art that was being made this time. I think the biggest impact, visually we have, so when you think about the Renaissance, is you think about art. And so today we're going to talk about how that got done and some important figures to go along with that. So to understand Renaissance art, you need to firstly understand the idea of the system of patronage. So here's your first little bit that you need to get into your note sheet. If you want to pause the video, fill those in real quick. I'll wait a second. All right, I'm going to assume you're back with me. So, patronage. Simple enough. If you want to distill it into something easy, it is pretty much paying an artist to make something for you. Pretty simple. And depending on the medium of what they're going to do it in, would be kind of what you're having them do. And so in this instance, how this came about was that Italians, like the Medicis, the wealthy traders of Florence, they would become very wealthy by trade and use that money to fund the arts. And because they had made all the money they needed for themselves, they didn't need any more, they were rich, and so they needed something else to do with their time and to do with their money. And so what they chose to do was to invest it in the arts. And when you are investing in the arts, when you are paying for art to be done, as I just said, that's called patronage. And a patron could commission or pay someone, hire someone to do a single work, or they could have them do multiple things for them. And so what you would do, as this artist was working for you, you would just give them money. And as long as it took them to do the work, that's how long you paid them for. Kind of like you pay anyone else to do a job for you. So large works could be, a couple months, but they could be years, depending on what the artist was being paid to do. And funny enough, if it was at a large estate or home of someone, the patron, that's the person who's paying, the patron would sometimes have the artist come live in their house. They might actually set up a workshop for a artisan to do work in, whether it was sculpting or painting, carving. They would just, they would be their own kind of private in-house artist just working for them. Pretty cool concept. Instead of just going on the internet and Googling something to print it off, you would have someone actually physically make something for you. And so cities like Florence would actually commission people. Michelangelo's sculpture of David, I'll show you guys here in just a few minutes, is an example of a city commissioning a work done for someone. And really the most famous people who would patronize things, the arts, would be the Medicis. We talked about the Medicis a couple days ago. Wealthy Italian family ruled for a couple hundred years the city of Florence, and they used much of their wealth to fund and pay for the art. So they would commission works by guys like Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, as well as Michelangelo, a couple guys we'll talk about. So this was a system that predated the Renaissance, but also really came to prominence during the Renaissance, this idea of patronage, of paying someone to do art for you. And this even happens today, guys. If you got a guy on SoundCloud asking for money, and you go to his Patreon and you give him money, or there's a GoFundMe to finish an album for somebody, that's patronage right there, too. You're paying for the arts to be made. I don't tell anybody don't tell anybody, but I'm actually I'm being a patron to a local artist to make something for my wife for Christmas. So this is a system that still even happens today of patronage. So the next way we look at art would be literature, writing. And so once again, I'll give you a second to get these written down. And we're back. And so Latin is still the predominant language of Europe. We've talked about this a couple different times because Latin was the language of the church. But throughout the Renaissance, there's going to be an increased use of vernacular languages. We learned that term. We talked about Japan. Vernacular just means local languages, the language of the common people, not the high class, not the highfalutin people, just the normal everyday people. And so vernacular languages that pieces will be written in during the Renaissance would include Italian, French, and German. And more people, obviously, knew how to read and write in vernacular than they did Latin. Latin was just the language of the church. You only needed it on Sunday, not any other time. And so people started thinking, well, how about we just have the Bible in regular languages we can learn? And so that's what they started to do. They started to publish the Bible in vernacular languages, French, German, later English. And people began to read the Bible for themselves. And this was a big shift because for so much of the time, it was reliant upon you going to church to learn about the Bible. But now people could read it for themselves, and they weren't as dependent on the priests as far as telling them, what the Bible says and what God may want them to do about something. And so this would actually kind of lessen the power of the church. And it would lead to what something's going to be called the Reformation, which we will talk about in a later lesson. So that's growth in literature through different languages. We've got patrons paying for works to be done. So now let's talk about a particular guy who is probably the most famous Renaissance writer, a guy by the name of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is going to be the most famous of the Renaissance writers. And this literature and writing from the Renaissance really comes to its peak under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I. And she is going to be the third child of King Henry VIII, which that's an awesome story, which we will get to later. But she's going to encourage what is known as secular theater. Some of the plays and the music and the theater that was being put out before this time was mainly focused on the church and telling morality and Bible stories. But she invested in telling stories that of a secular nature. We've already talked about that term secular being non-religious. And Shakespeare is going to be the most famous of these secular writers because he wrote not about the church, but about people and their lives, their strengths, their weaknesses, and their emotions. Many of his plays are still studied and performed even to this day. When you guys get to high school, you're probably going to read through a couple different Shakespearean plays. Good luck with that. They still confuse me. So Shakespeare would take many of his ideas of plays from the histories of England and from ancient Rome. Most famously, you would think of Julius Caesar. That would be one of his plays, as well as Macbeth, King Lear. Various histories he based his plays on, many of them tragedies. Many people died. Really good stuff. He talks funny, but lots of people die. There's ghosts. Crazy stuff. I would check it out. He also wrote a lot of comedies as well. Pretty smart dude. And one of the really interesting things about Shakespeare, he actually has influenced our common language. Many of phrases that we have that we use today actually came from Shakespearean plays and his works. So this guy's reach as far as on the English language really can't be compared to a lot of other people. And he came out of this Renaissance, this time when the Queen, Elizabeth I, found it beneficial to pay him to make works of art. And we're still benefiting from it today. So it's super cool. William Shakespeare in literature. So let's move on to some visual artists. And the first one we got is Leonardo da Vinci. So Da Vinci was a humanist scholar. We talked about humanism in our last lesson, and how humanism, in that idea, it focuses on the person, the individual, not God, not other things in society, but really focusing on the person. And he was curious about a lot of other subjects, not just art, even though he was a great artist. He looked into astronomy, anatomy, biology, and one of the kind of creepy things he did is he actually more or less dissected human bodies so he could learn about the anatomy of a person. He's got a famous rendering of the model of the human being and its different movements. And many of his drawings were very lifelike because he studied the human body. He would also look at fossils to understand the history of the world as well. And he wasn't just an artist, but Da Vinci was an inventor and also an engineer. He made many designs of different inventions that he would try to build. And there are many other things that he never was able to build, but as they have uncovered throughout history, his different sketchbooks, you see in there that there are these machines that he had imagined and he had made plans for, but never was able to make. On the screen right now is it's kind of a glider flying machine that he tried to design. He was fascinated by flight and the movement of birds and the fluidity of how they soared through the air, and he thought, you know what? I think people can do that. And so he made ways to figure out how to do that with parachutes and flying machines. And a lot of these things were so far ahead of their time. I mean, decades and decades of where we'd be like, well, that shouldn't have happened then, but you see in these documents that he was on the forefront of technology and figuring things out. So super fascinating with Da Vinci. His most famous piece of art, if you want to focus just on the art, would have been the Mona Lisa. You have more than likely seen this somewhere, Miss Mona Lisa. This is his most famous piece of art. Probably second to it would be the Last Supper, where he depicts Jesus and the disciples eating for a meal. So we got one more guy we're going to look at, is Michelangelo. He was an architect, a poet, a sculptor, and he's got a couple of things he's most famous for. Number one would be the one on the screen right now, which would be his sculpture of David, biblical king, probably known him from killing a big giant, cutting his head off and being like, woo! Well, I don't really know if he did that last part, but I know he killed a giant, cut his head off, and then he became king. Did a lot of other stuff, but that's just kind of the gist of David. So this is the most famous thing he's known for as far as sculpture would be the sculpture of David. Also with Mary, Mary the mother of Jesus. And probably where his largest work would have been that when he was commissioned by the Pope to do a work in the Sistine Chapel, which is this right here. Give you a second to kind of drink that in. He painted all of that along the walls, the ceiling. So this was commissioned in a couple different parts. So this is a Sistine Chapel, a cathedral in Italy, and he was commissioned by two different popes to work on this. So the first thing he was commissioned to do was the ceiling right here. And so he did the ceiling in about 4 years. Took him to do this. And you might be thinking, Mr. Skaggs, how did he do that? Well, he could fly. He took one of Da Vinci's flying machines, and he was like flying and painting and stuff. If you believe me that he was flying and painting, I'm sorry. No, he didn't paint. He didn't paint like that. What it was, they had a system of scaffolds built up, these platforms that he was on, and actually, so he could paint the most comfortably, he actually had it put all the way up to the roof, and he actually laid on his back and painted for 4 years. Crazy stuff. Laying on your back, painting for 4 years. So he was able to do that. And the most famous scene of the Sistine Chapel would be in the center, where this depicts the creation, where God bent down and gave life to Adam. That's the first one. And then he did those around here. But then about 15 years later, the next pope commissioned him to do this piece behind the altar known as the Last Judgment. And so in the center, you've got Jesus, his disciples, and then many other figures from the Bible seemingly coming to that last day when God was to judge the whole world. And so these two different pieces were commissioned for Michelangelo to do by the church. So not all commissions were done by secular people for secular reasons, but many of it was religious-based, because adopting the ideas of humanism from Thomas Aquinas, many painters and artists saw themselves using their talent, their ability, humanism, what I can do, but they saw the inspiration from God, that the ultimate creator of beauty was God. And so their art that they drew was just an extension of their Christianity, of their faith. So it's really cool how those two things kind of meld in to each other when we're talking about Renaissance art. And that would lead us to right over here, Standard 743, which we've just covered rather quickly. So, but I think you guys can handle it. So what I want you to do, that's it for 743. I would like you to look back over the information on your note sheet, and I need you to highlight information that's going to go along with this standard about Renaissance art, significance of those three dudes, and what is patronage. After you've got that done, go ahead and cut this out, glue it into your composition book. It'll look something like that when you are done. Hope you've enjoyed this distant lesson, and I will see you in class soon.